The Moni Cycles is going to be the perfect bike for our soon-to-be steampunk post-apocalyptic future. In all seriousness, it's a pretty interesting gravel/ATV that looks like a custom bike but can be had for production bike money. So let's get into it. If you're not familiar with Moni bikes, definitely check out our live stream with Shell. We go into a pretty long discussion into his design philosophy and inspiration behind his bikes. This particular bike is the La Roca, great name by the way. In this configuration, it's fully rigid, but it is suspension corrected so you can put a squishy fork in there. And speaking of forks, let's take a look at this one. It's a really interesting mix of kind of rugged steampunkness, but still manages to be elegant with that exposed brazing and that gentle curve to the fork leg. It's a biplane construction, has 3-pack mounts so you can carry all the things, and has boost spacing. The bike has clearances so you can run 27.5 plus or even 29er wheel sets. On this bike, it's got 27.5 by 2.6 inch tires in the form of the Maxxis Recon. The bike has through axles and it's running hydraulic disc brakes, Shimano SLX in this instance. Moving to the controls, it's got some really nice touches, this kind of patinaed stem spacer, custom short stubby stem, again with that exposed kind of brazing look to it. And of course the odd Moni handlebars. They're moto style with that little crossbar on them. They do raise the hand position up and there is just like the tiniest bit of sweep. There's also lots of really interesting custom touches to this bike, like these brass handlebar end caps and even these cool brass Presta valves. Moving to the main part of the frame, you'll notice a pretty aggressive sloping top tube and a really short seat tube. And this is nice so you have that stand over for off-road technical riding. The short seat tube also makes it so if you're riding smaller size frames, you can get full use out of that dropper post. Cranks are SRAM 1x with a 34 tooth chainring. Moving to the rear, you'll notice it's got all the mounts. You can put a rack on it. In this instance, it's running the Old Man mountain rack, which actually connects to the through axle and to mounting points on the seat stays. The drivetrain is a fairly new to me TRP 1x12 speed drivetrain, which is pretty interesting. It shifted well, not a whole lot to say about it. I think this bike was spec'd out during pandemic time, hence the TRP drivetrain. You'll notice even with the 27.5 by 2.6, there is a ton of clearance in the rear, so you can definitely load on some fat meats. These cool painters are by a brand called Buckhorn. They're wax canvas. They attach to the rack via volet straps and they totally match the look of this bike. Other finishing touches are the PNW dropper, Brooks saddle, and again this custom seat post binder. So many interesting touches and hits of that brass color. One cool thing about this bike is that even though it does have those custom touches and looks super deep custom, it is produced in Taiwan, so that brings the cost down to I think like $1,300 for the frame set. Enough of the boring stuff. How does this bike ride? There's some interesting things about this bike. If you look at the chainstay, it's got some clamping binder bolts, and the chainstay is actually fairly adjustable. I believe you can fudge with it all the way as tucked as 405 to like 430 on the longer end. The bike, as I rode it, I measured it out to about 430. The front end of the bike has a fair amount of trail. I think Bike Insights puts it at 115. Moni lists it at 119, but basically a fairly high trail, progressive mountain bike front end. What's interesting to me is that for something with such, I guess, relatively extreme geo numbers, it rode surprisingly neutral. On level ground, it plowed through everything. On climbs, I was expecting something that felt more super slack and unwieldy on slow speed climbs, but the bike tracked relatively straight without excessive wheel flop or drunken goatiness, as I like to call it, which was a pretty big surprise to me. I think the mitigating factors are the really short and stubby stem and the wild bars. It kind of neutralizes that potential for wheel flop. The bike was also a relatively responsive climber. I didn't really get a chance to mess around with the chainstays and make it super tucked, but at this 430 length, it wasn't super jumpy, but it was more responsive of a climber than say the Wild Super Tramp or the Husky Doggler. I think it's cool that there is this sliding dropout option, so you can dial up that spiciness in the rear if you want to run it super tucked, and you can have that jumpy rear, swoopy front end bike of your dreams. Going downhill on 2-track or dirt roads, the bike just ate it all up. Where skinny curly bar gravel bikes might have to be reeled back on these like chonkier descents, the La Roca didn't even flinch. It was like, whatever, I'll meet you at the bottom. So I think if you find yourself as a usually tepid descender on dirt roads, then this bike could compensate for that. Going on the green flowy trails that I usually ride, the bike handled it beautifully. It had that swoopy, modern, progressive mountain bike feel in the front. Comparing it with recent bikes I've tested, I found the Wild with the more all-rounder lower trail, you had to micromanage the steering a little bit more. It was a little bit more responsive. Interestingly, I found the Dogler, which I recently reviewed, to feel slacker. It was just that much more swoopier, kind of inviting a little bit more aggressive riding in the turns. The La Roca definitely sat in between these two bikes. One real noticeable thing is the higher bottom bracket on this bike. Where I was slapping roots on the Dogler, this bike cleared just fine. What are the pros and cons? I really enjoy the geometry. It's definitely slacker feeling than the Wild, but doesn't go so extreme that it feels like ass on just like a dirt road. I love the look of the bike. I love that, it has that custom bike look, but for production bike money. And I also love the ability to mess around with the chainstay, so you can really dial in the ride that you want on this bike. In terms of downsides, there are a few things. Probably the biggest one to me is the weight. This is a surprisingly chunky bike. As you see it in its current outfit with the racks and everything, it weighed in at about 36 pounds on our scales, which is a lot. I think. It doesn't look like it should weigh that much, but you definitely feel the inertia going uphill, and I think it takes a little bit away from the playfulness of the bike. Another downside is that I felt that the front end was fairly stiff to me. I think it could be these moto style bars where they're a little bit stiffer, so you can really ride aggressively and not lose the front end, but at the same time it doesn't allow as much bar flex. And not to mention, this is just like a me thing, but my hands definitely require a little bit more back sweep to be comfortable. At the end of the day, I think this is a pretty versatile and great looking bike, perfect for a fully rigid ATB build if you want to go that route. Again, slacker feeling than the Super Tramp, but not as slack as the Dogler that I just recently reviewed. It's got a lot of those cues that we expect from custom bikes, but again, it's a production bike, which is pretty cool. And bonus, if or when we reach the steampunk apocalyptic future, you've got the perfect bike for it. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, definitely support the channel by hitting up our merch store. We still have a bunch of these party paste shirts as well as stickers. I can't tell you how much it truly supports the channel and allows us to operate without any sponsorship. If you're into that, you know what to do, and as always, keep the supple side down.